Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives Deep Dive series, where we explore the history, culture, and geography of nations all around the world. Today, we're heading to the southwest coast of Africa to uncover the story of Angola, a country known for its rich natural resources, diverse landscapes, and a history shaped by both ancient kingdoms and centuries of colonial rule. From the vibrant capital of Luanda to the breathtaking waterfalls of Kalandula, Angola has so much more to offer than many people realize. Before we dive in, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing how far and wide our community stretches. And if you're enjoying this series, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you'll always be here for the next deep dive. Alright, let's get started on our journey through Angola. Chapter 1: Introduction and Geographical Setting. Welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where we journey through time and space to explore the hidden stories written in the landscapes of our world. Tonight, we turn our attention to Angola, a land of remarkable contrasts nestled along Africa's southwestern coast. As you settle into your evening rest, let us embark together on a gentle exploration of this extraordinary nation, where ancient kingdoms once flourished, and where the Atlantic Ocean meets the vast African interior. Angola stretches across more than 1,200,000 square kilometers of southwestern Africa, making it the seventh largest country on the continent. To understand Angola's story, we must first appreciate its remarkable geography, for the land itself has shaped the destinies of its peoples for millennia. Picture, if you will, the gentle Atlantic waves lapping against Angola's extensive coastline, which extends for over 1,600 kilometers from the mouth of the Congo River in the north to the Namibian border in the south. This coastal region, known as the coastal lowland, rises from the sea in a series of low terraces and plains. Near the historic city of Benguela, this coastal band narrows to just 25 kilometers, while in the Kwanza River Valley, south of the capital Luanda, it expands to over 150 kilometers of fertile land. The coastal climate here is profoundly influenced by the Benguela Current, a cold ocean current that flows northward along the coast. This current brings with it a paradox. While it creates relatively dry conditions along the shore, it also supports some of the richest fishing grounds in the world. The interaction between this cold current and the warm African landmass creates unique weather patterns that have influenced human settlement for thousands of years. As we move inland from this coastal plain, the landscape transforms dramatically. The land rises abruptly through hills and mountains, creating what geographers call the Great Escarpment. This dramatic rise in elevation forms one of Africa's most striking geographical features, as the terrain climbs from sea level to heights of 3,000 to 7,000 feet above the ocean. The highest point in Angola, Mount Moro de Moco in Huambo province, reaches an elevation of 2,620 meters, standing as a silent sentinel over the surrounding highlands. Beyond this escarpment lies Angola's vast interior, the high plateau or Planalto as it was known to Portuguese colonizers. This highland region extends eastward like an enormous table, forming one of Africa's largest watersheds. Here, the headwaters of mighty rivers begin their journeys, some flowing west toward the Atlantic, others meandering north toward the Congo Basin, and still others turning south toward the great river systems of southern Africa. The climate across Angola varies dramatically with these changes in elevation and distance from the coast. The coastal region experiences a semi-arid climate, with temperatures moderated by the ocean's influence. As we move inland and upward, the climate becomes more tropical, with distinct wet and dry seasons. The rainy season, typically lasting from October through May, brings life-giving precipitation that transforms the landscape from brown and dormant to green and vibrant. The northern regions of Angola receive the most rainfall, sometimes exceeding 1,000 millimeters annually, creating lush forests and fertile agricultural land. As we move south, the climate becomes progressively drier, with the southern provinces experiencing semi-arid conditions and periodic droughts that test the resilience of both the land and its inhabitants. This geographic diversity has created distinct ecological zones across Angola. In the north, dense tropical forests harbour incredible biodiversity, while the central highlands support vast grasslands dotted with trees. The southern regions are characterized by savanna and scrubland, where drought-resistant vegetation has adapted to harsh conditions. Along the coast, unique desert and semi-desert ecosystems thrive in the shadow of the Benguela Current's influence. Angola's river systems tell their own story of geographic complexity. The mighty Kwanza River, from which the country derives its name in some historical accounts, flows westward through the heart of the nation before emptying into the Atlantic near Luanda. The Congo River forms part of Angola's northern border, carrying the waters of Central Africa toward the sea. In the south, the Kunene River marks the boundary with Namibia, while numerous smaller rivers create a network of waterways that have served as highways for trade and migration throughout history. The province of Cabinda presents a unique geographic puzzle. This small territory, separated from the rest of Angola by the Democratic Republic of Congo's narrow coastal strip, sits like an island of Angolan sovereignty, surrounded by foreign territory. Rich in oil deposits, Cabinda's unusual geographic position has made it both a blessing and a challenge for the Angolan nation. Beneath Angola's varied landscapes lie some of Africa's most valuable natural resources. Diamonds sparkle in the ancient gravels of the northeast, while petroleum deposits along the coast and offshore have transformed the nation's economy. Iron ore, copper, and other minerals lie embedded in the rocks of the interior, representing wealth that has attracted outside interest for centuries. The vegetation patterns across Angola reflect this geographic and climatic diversity. The coastal desert gradually gives way to savanna grasslands, which in turn transition to woodland savanna and finally to dense forest in the north. Each of these ecological zones has supported different ways of life throughout history, from the fishing communities of the coast to the agricultural societies of the highlands and the forest peoples of the north. As night settles over Angola today, from the bustling streets of Luanda to the quiet villages of the interior, we can sense the profound influence that geography has exerted on this nation's story. The narrow coastal plain that encouraged early maritime contact, the dramatic escarpment that provided natural fortification, and the vast interior plateau that offered both opportunity and challenge, all of these features have shaped the human drama that has unfolded here across the centuries. The seasonal rhythms of rain and drought, the north-south gradient from forest to desert, and the east-west transition from coast to interior have all played their parts in Angola's history. As we prepare to explore that history, let us remember that every kingdom, every conflict, every moment of triumph or tragedy has been intimately connected to this remarkable landscape. In the gentle darkness of your evening, imagine the vastness of Angola's high plateau under a canopy of stars, the distant sound of Atlantic waves against the coast, and the quiet flow of rivers carrying their ancient stories toward the sea. This is the stage upon which one of Africa's most compelling historical dramas has unfolded, and it is here that we now turn our attention to the peoples and cultures who have called this land home. Chapter 2: Ancient Foundations and Early People. As the first light of human consciousness dawned over Angola's ancient landscapes, we encounter peoples whose stories stretch back through countless generations, their voices echoing across millennia in the languages, traditions, and archaeological traces they left behind. Tonight, we travel back through the mists of time to discover the foundations upon which Angola's rich cultural tapestry was woven. Long before written records began to chronicle events in this corner of Africa, small groups of hunter-gatherers roamed across Angola's varied landscapes. These earliest inhabitants, whose lives were intimately connected to the rhythms of the natural world, left subtle traces of their presence in rock art and stone tools scattered across the countryside. They lived lightly on the land, following seasonal patterns of rainfall and animal migration, their knowledge of the environment passed down through generations in songs, stories, and survival skills. But the great transformation that would reshape Angola's human landscape came with the arrival of Bantu-speaking peoples in what historians call the Bantu expansion. This was not a sudden invasion, but rather a gradual migration and cultural diffusion that unfolded over centuries, beginning around 2,000 years ago. Picture these early Bantu communities, carrying with them revolutionary technologies, iron tools that could clear forests more effectively than stone implements, agricultural knowledge that allowed them to cultivate crops in Angola's fertile soils, and pottery traditions that would leave distinctive marks in the archaeological record. The Bantu expansion into Angola was like a slow tide of cultural and technological innovation. These peoples brought with them not just new tools and techniques, but new ways of organizing society, new languages that would evolve into the diverse linguistic landscape of modern Angola, and new spiritual beliefs that would blend with existing traditions. They were farmers and metalworkers, community builders who established permanent settlements along Angola's rivers and in its fertile valleys. As these Bantu-speaking communities settled across Angola's varied landscapes, they adapted their ways of life to local conditions. In the forests of the north, they developed sophisticated agricultural systems that worked with the forest environment rather than against it. In the grasslands of the Central Plateau, they became skilled cattle herders and farmers, creating communities that could thrive in the seasonal rhythms of wet and dry periods. Along the rivers, they built settlements that took advantage of both fishing and agricultural opportunities. Over centuries, these scattered communities began to coalesce into larger political entities. By the 13th century, the first major kingdom to emerge in the region was taking shape, the Great Kingdom of Congo. This remarkable state would grow to dominate much of northern Angola and extend its influence far beyond what we now consider the country's borders. The Kingdom of Congo, according to the oral traditions carefully preserved by court historians and passed down through generations, was founded around 1390 by a leader known as Lukeni Luanimi. The kingdom's origins lie in the coming together of several important clans and communities in the fertile regions near the mouth of the Congo River. According to these ancient traditions, Nimi and Nzima of Mpemba Kasi and Nsaku Lao of Mbata established the foundations of what would become a great state, agreeing that descendants of Nimi and Nzima would rule the kingdom, while those of Nsaku Lao would govern the important province of Mbata. What began as perhaps a loose confederation of related communities gradually evolved into something far more sophisticated. The Kingdom of Congo developed a complex administrative system that allowed it to govern a vast territory stretching from Gabon in the north to the Kwanza River in the south, and from the Atlantic coast eastward to the Kongo River. At its height, this kingdom controlled an area larger than many modern European nations. The capital of this remarkable kingdom was Mbanza Congo, later known as São Salvador, situated in what is now northern Angola. Here, the Manikongo, The title given to the kingdom's rulers held court in a setting that impressed even European visitors with its sophistication and organization. The city was carefully planned, with royal compounds, administrative buildings, markets, and residential areas arranged according to both practical needs and symbolic importance. The Kingdom of Congo was far from a simple monarchy. Its political structure was sophisticated and nuanced, incorporating elements of both centralized authority and local autonomy. The kingdom was divided into provinces, each governed by appointed officials who owed allegiance to the Congo, but also had significant authority within their own territories. The most important provinces included Soyo, which controlled access to the Atlantic coast, and Mbata, whose rulers traced their ancestry to the kingdom's founders. Trade was the lifeblood of the Kingdom of Congo. The kingdom's strategic position allowed it to control important trade routes that connected the interior of Africa with the Atlantic coast. Merchants carried goods along well-established paths that crossed rivers on impressive ferry systems and wound through carefully maintained mountain passes. From the interior came ivory, copper, and later slaves, while coastal regions provided salt and fish. The kingdom also became renowned for its textiles, particularly the beautiful raffia cloth woven from palm fibers and decorated with intricate geometric patterns. The monetary system of Congo was based on nzimbu shells, small shells collected from beds along the Atlantic coast. These shells became a standard of exchange throughout the kingdom and beyond, creating one of Africa's most sophisticated pre-colonial monetary systems. The careful regulation of shell collection and distribution helped maintain economic stability across the kingdom's vast territory. But Congo was not the only significant political entity to emerge in ancient Angola. South of the Kwanza River, other kingdoms were taking shape, each adapted to its particular environment and circumstances. The Kingdom of Ndongo, sometimes referred to in early sources as Angola, from which the modern country takes its name, emerged in the highlands between the Lukala and Kwanza rivers during the 16th century. The rulers of Ndongo bore the title Angola, a word that would eventually give its name to the entire region. The Kingdom of Ndongo developed its own distinct political and cultural traditions, while maintaining complex relationships with neighboring states. To the east lay Matamba, another significant kingdom that would play a crucial role in later resistance to Portuguese colonization. These kingdoms were not isolated from one another, but existed within a complex web of relationships that included trade, intermarriage, alliance, and occasional conflict. Diplomatic missions traveled between royal courts, carrying messages, negotiating treaties, and maintaining the delicate balance of power that characterized the region. The kingdoms shared many cultural elements, similar languages, religious beliefs, artistic traditions, and social structures, while maintaining their distinct identities and territories. The spiritual life of these ancient Angolan kingdoms was rich and complex. Ancestor veneration formed the foundation of religious practice, with deceased rulers and important figures continuing to play active roles in the affairs of the living. Sacred objects, rituals, and ceremonies maintained the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. Traditional healers, known by various names throughout the region, served as intermediaries between human communities and the spiritual forces that governed health, fertility, and prosperity. Art and culture flourished within these kingdoms. Skilled craftspeople created beautiful works in metal, wood, ivory, and textiles. Royal regalia included elaborate staffs, crowns, and ceremonial weapons that symbolized political authority and spiritual power. Music and dance were integral parts of both religious ceremonies and political events, with court musicians maintaining repertoires of songs that preserved historical events and royal genealogies. The agricultural foundation of these kingdoms was sophisticated and sustainable. Farmers developed crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility, and they cultivated a diverse array of plants, including millet, sorghum, yams, and later crops introduced from the Americas. Cattle, goats, and chickens provided animal protein and products, while skilled artisans worked with materials ranging from iron and copper to plant fibers and clay. As night falls over the lands where these ancient kingdoms once flourished, we can still sense their presence in the customs and languages of modern Angola. The Kimbundu, Kikongo, and other Bantu languages spoken today carry within them the wisdom and worldview of these early peoples. Traditional political structures, though modified by centuries of change, still influence how communities organize themselves and make decisions. The great kingdoms of ancient Angola created foundations that would profoundly influence everything that followed. They established patterns of political organization, trade relationships, and cultural development that would persist even through the dramatic changes brought by European contact. Their stories remind us that Africa has always been a continent of sophisticated civilizations, innovative peoples, and rich cultural traditions. In the quiet hours of your evening, imagine the ancient capitals of these kingdoms. Mbanza, Congo, with its organized streets and royal compounds, the highland strongholds of Ndongo, and the trading centers where merchants from across Central Africa gathered to exchange goods and stories. These were places of learning and culture, of political sophistication and artistic achievement, of spiritual depth and community solidarity. Chapter 3. The Portuguese Arrival and the Colonial Era. In the closing decades of the 15th century, as Angola's great kingdoms reached the height of their power and sophistication, distant events in Europe would set in motion changes that would forever alter the trajectory of this ancient land. Tonight, we explore one of history's most consequential encounters, the meeting of two worlds along Angola's Atlantic shore and the long colonial era that would follow. The year was 1483, when Portuguese explorer Diogo Cao first encountered the mouth of the Great Congo River during his voyage along the African coast. Standing on the deck of his ship, watching the brown waters of Africa's second-largest river flow into the blue Atlantic, Cao could hardly have imagined the profound consequences that would flow from this moment of first contact. He erected a stone pillar, a padrão, to mark Portugal's claim to this coast. But the true significance of his arrival lay not in symbolic stones, but in the human connections that would soon follow. The Portuguese approach to Angola was initially quite different from the conquest-oriented strategies they employed elsewhere. When Portuguese envoys first made contact with the Kingdom of Congo, they encountered a sophisticated state that commanded respect. In 1491, King Nzinga Nkuwu of Congo made a decision that would reverberate through centuries. He chose to convert to Christianity, taking the name João I in honor of the Portuguese king. This conversion was not merely a personal spiritual decision, but a calculated political move. The Manicongo saw in Portugal a potential ally that could provide new technologies, particularly firearms, and new trade opportunities. The Portuguese, for their part, viewed a Christian kingdom in Central Africa as both a valuable trading partner and a potential base for further expansion into the continent's interior. The relationship between Portugal and Congo began with what seemed to be mutual benefit. Portuguese craftsmen arrived to teach new techniques in construction and metalworking. Christian missionaries established schools and began the complex process of translating religious texts into local languages. Trade relationships developed that brought European goods to African markets while sending African products, initially primarily ivory, copper, and luxury items, to European ports. However, Beneath this surface of diplomatic cooperation and cultural exchange, more troubling currents were beginning to flow. The Portuguese demand for slaves, initially to work sugar plantations on islands like São Tomé, gradually began to distort traditional relationships within and between African kingdoms. What had once been limited slavery, connected to warfare and judicial punishment, began to expand as Portuguese traders offered increasingly attractive goods in exchange for human captives. King Afonso I of Congo, who ruled from 1506 to 1543, embodied the complexity and tragedy of this period. Educated by Portuguese priests and genuinely committed to Christianity, Afonso corresponded regularly with Portuguese kings and even sent his son Henrique to study in Europe, making Henrique one of the first African bishops in the Catholic Church. Yet Afonso also found himself increasingly troubled by the Portuguese appetite for slaves, writing poignant letters to King João III of Portugal, protesting the damage that slave trading was causing to his kingdom. In one of his most famous letters, Afonso wrote of his distress at seeing his people captured and sold, declaring that his kingdom was being depopulated by Portuguese merchants who showed no regard for law or justice. These letters, preserved in Portuguese archives, provide a haunting first-hand account of how the slave trade began to undermine the very foundations of African political and social structures. As the 16th century progressed, Portuguese interest shifted increasingly southward from Congo toward the Kingdom of Ndongo, whose ruler bore the title Nola. The Portuguese were attracted by reports of silver mines in the interior and by the possibilities for expanding their slave trading operations. In 1575, Paulo Dias de Novais established the settlement of São Paulo de Luanda, modern-day Luanda, on a small island in a natural harbour south of the Kwanza River mouth. The founding of Luanda marked a turning point in Portuguese engagement with Angola. Unlike the diplomatic relationship initially established with Congo, Portuguese expansion into Ndongo territory was characterized by military conquest and territorial occupation. The Portuguese built a series of forts along the Kwanza River valley, using these as bases for further penetration into the interior. The resistance they encountered was formidable. The peoples of the Angolan highlands were skilled warriors who used their knowledge of local terrain to great advantage. They developed sophisticated defensive strategies, including the construction of hilltop fortifications called quilombos, and they gradually acquired and learned to use Portuguese firearms captured in battle. One of the most remarkable figures of this resistance was Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, who ruled from 1624 to 1663. Nzinga was a political and military genius who understood that successful resistance required both battlefield prowess and diplomatic sophistication. She forged alliances with other African kingdoms, negotiated with Dutch competitors to Portuguese power, and even temporarily converted to Christianity when it served her political purposes, only to abandon the faith when circumstances changed. Nzinga's resistance to Portuguese expansion became legendary throughout Central Africa. She personally led her armies in battle, established alternative trade routes that bypassed Portuguese control, and created safe havens for escaped slaves and refugees from Portuguese-controlled territories. Her kingdom of Matamba became a symbol of African independence and resistance that inspired other liberation movements throughout the region. The Portuguese colonial presence in Angola during these early centuries was quite limited in geographic scope, but profound in its impact on the regions under their control. They established a series of coastal and river settlements connected by precarious supply lines and surrounded by often hostile territory. The colonial administration was chronically understaffed and underfinanced, dependent on support from Brazil and metropolitan Portugal that often arrived late or not at all. The heart of Portuguese Angola became the slave trade. By the early 17th century, Luanda had developed into one of the most important slave ports in Africa. Ships arrived regularly from Brazil, carrying goods to trade for human cargo, then departed across the Atlantic, with holds full of enslaved Africans destined for sugar plantations, gold mines, and other forced labor in the Americas. The numbers are staggering and sobering. Historians estimate that between the 16th and 19th centuries, more than 3 million enslaved people were shipped from Angola to the Americas, with perhaps millions more dying during capture, transport to the coast, or in the holding compounds where they waited for ships. The demographic impact on Angola was catastrophic, draining the country of much of its young adult population and disrupting family and community structures across vast areas. The slave trade also had profound economic effects. Traditional African industries and agriculture declined as communities focused on slave raiding and trading rather than productive activities. The introduction of European goods, while providing some benefits, also undermined local craft production. Communities became dependent on imported items while their own technological development stagnated. Portuguese colonial settlements during this period were small urban islands in a vast African countryside. Luanda grew into a significant town, with stone churches, government buildings, and merchant houses reflecting European architectural styles adapted to tropical conditions. But even at its height, the Portuguese colonial presence was thin and precarious, dependent on alliances with African chiefs and military superiority based largely on firearms. The social structure that developed in Portuguese Angola was complex and often contradictory. A small white Portuguese elite occupied the top of the social hierarchy, but below them were various mixed-race populations, freed slaves, and Africans who had adopted Portuguese culture and religion. These intermediate groups often served as interpreters, traders, and administrators, bridging the gap between Portuguese and African societies. Christianity, as introduced by Portuguese missionaries, created another layer of complexity. While some African leaders and communities embraced the new religion, others maintained traditional beliefs, and many developed syncretic practices that blended Christian and African spiritual traditions. These religious fusions would prove remarkably durable, influencing Angolan culture right up to the present day. The Portuguese colonial economy remained focused on extraction rather than development. In addition to slaves, Portuguese merchants exported ivory, beeswax, and other natural products, but they made little effort to develop local industries or improve agricultural productivity. The colony existed primarily to serve Portuguese and Brazilian interests, rather than to benefit its African inhabitants. As the 17th and 18th centuries progressed, Portuguese control gradually expanded inland, but this expansion was slow, costly, and frequently contested. African communities developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for resisting Portuguese expansion, including the formation of military alliances, the adoption of Portuguese weapons and tactics, and the creation of independent kingdoms in regions beyond Portuguese reach. The long night of early colonialism in Angola was marked by extraordinary human suffering, but also by remarkable examples of African resistance, adaptation, and survival. Communities preserved their languages, customs, and identities even under tremendous pressure. They created new forms of cultural expression that incorporated both African and European elements while maintaining distinctly African characteristics. In the gentle darkness of your evening, as you reflect on this difficult chapter of Angola's story, remember that even in the darkest periods of history, human dignity and cultural creativity find ways to survive and flourish. The peoples of Angola endured centuries of exploitation and oppression, but they never lost their fundamental humanity or their connections to the ancient traditions that had sustained them for generations. Chapter 4: Colonial Consolidation and Resistance. As the 19th century dawned over Angola, the winds of change were stirring across both Africa and Europe, bringing with them new challenges and opportunities that would reshape the colonial relationship in profound ways. Tonight, we explore a century of transformation, where Portuguese colonial ambitions grew more systematic, while African resistance became more sophisticated, setting the stage for the conflicts that would define Angola's path to independence. The abolition of the slave trade, first by Britain in 1807 and eventually by Portugal in 1836, marked the end of an era that had defined Portuguese Angola for over 3 centuries. Yet this change, while momentous, did not bring immediate relief to Angola's peoples. Instead, it forced both Portuguese colonizers and African communities to adapt to new economic and political realities. For Portugal, the end of the slave trade created an urgent need to find new sources of profit from their African territories. Portuguese colonial administrators began to envision Angola not merely as a source of human cargo, but as a potential settler colony that could produce tropical crops and raw materials for European markets. This vision would drive Portuguese policy throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, leading to more systematic efforts to control Angola's interior and exploit its natural resources. The famous explorer and missionary David Livingstone, though Scottish rather than Portuguese, embodied the new European attitude toward Africa. His travels through Angola in the 1850s brought international attention to the region's geography and resources, while also highlighting the continuing devastation caused by the slave trade. Livingstone's accounts of his journey from the interior to Luanda painted a picture of a land rich in potential but scarred by centuries of human exploitation. Portuguese expansion into Angola's interior during this period was gradual but relentless. The colonial government established new military posts along river routes, built roads to connect coastal settlements with inland regions, and encouraged Portuguese settlers to establish farms and trading posts in previously unexplored areas. This expansion was neither smooth nor unopposed. It unfolded through decades of negotiation, conflict, and accommodation with African communities. One of the most significant developments of this era was the gradual abolition of the traditional kingdoms that had governed Angola for centuries. Portuguese administrators, influenced by European ideas about direct colonial control, systematically dismantled the political structures that had once provided order and legitimacy across the Angolan landscape. The great kingdom of Congo, which had maintained its independence for over 400 years of Portuguese presence on the coast, finally saw its power broken as Portuguese control extended northward. The process of colonial consolidation was neither quick nor easy. Portuguese forces faced determined resistance from African communities who understood that the new colonial order threatened not just their political independence, but their entire way of life. Unlike the earlier period of coastal trading posts and diplomatic relationships, the new Portuguese approach demanded direct control over African land, labor, and resources. African resistance took many forms during this period. Some communities chose direct military confrontation, using knowledge of local terrain and guerrilla tactics to harass Portuguese expeditions and supply lines. Others pursued diplomatic strategies, attempting to preserve some degree of autonomy through negotiated agreements with colonial administrators. Still others chose the path of accommodation, hoping to maintain their community's survival by adapting to colonial demands while preserving what they could of their traditional ways of life. The Ovimbundu peoples of the Central Highlands developed particularly sophisticated resistance strategies. Living in the region around present-day Huambo and Bié, the Ovimbundu controlled important trade routes connecting the coast with the interior. Their kingdoms, including the powerful state of Bié, maintained independence well into the late 19th century through a combination of military resistance, diplomatic maneuvering, and control over long-distance trade networks. The story of the Ovimbundu resistance illustrates the complexity of African responses to colonial expansion. These communities were not simply opposing European influence. Many had been involved in trade relationships with Portuguese merchants for generations. What they resisted was the transformation of these relationships from partnerships between independent entities into subordination to colonial control. The final conquest of Bié in 1890 came only after a prolonged campaign that demonstrated both the determination of African resistance and the increasing technological advantages available to European colonial forces. The Portuguese victory marked the end of the last major independent African kingdom in central Angola, but it came at enormous cost in both human lives and resources. Portuguese colonial policy during this period was characterized by what officials called the civilizing mission, a paternalistic ideology that portrayed Portuguese rule as beneficial to African peoples. According to this worldview, Portuguese colonization would bring Christianity, European education, and modern technology to supposedly backward African societies. This rhetoric masked the economic motives behind colonial expansion while providing moral justification for the subjugation of African peoples. The reality of Portuguese colonial rule was far harsher than the rhetoric suggested. The colonial government instituted forced labor systems that compelled African men to work on Portuguese-owned plantations, in mines, or on public works projects for minimal wages. These labor systems, while not technically slavery, created conditions of exploitation that were often little different from the bondage that had supposedly been abolished. The infamous contract labor system, known as contrato, became one of the most oppressive features of Portuguese colonial rule. Under this system, African men were required to work for Portuguese employers for specified periods, often far from their home communities. The contracts were supposedly voluntary, but in practice, they were enforced through taxation policies that made it impossible for African families to survive without sending their men into contract labor. Women and children were not exempt from colonial exploitation. Portuguese settlers and administrators imposed new agricultural requirements that forced African communities to grow specific crops for colonial markets, rather than for their own subsistence. Traditional patterns of crop rotation and land use were disrupted, leading to soil depletion and food insecurity in many regions. The Portuguese also attempted to transform African society through religious and educational policies. Catholic missions were established throughout the colony, often serving as instruments of cultural assimilation as well as religious conversion. Mission schools taught Portuguese language and European customs, while discouraging the use of African languages and traditions. Yet even within this system of cultural suppression, African communities found ways to preserve their heritage and adapt foreign influences to their own purposes. One of the most remarkable aspects of this period was the emergence of new forms of African political organization that combined traditional leadership structures with modern resistance strategies. African leaders learned to navigate colonial bureaucracies while maintaining their community's loyalty and identity. They used Christian churches, mission schools, and even colonial administrative positions as platforms for preserving African interests and preparing for future liberation. The economic transformation of Angola during this period was profound and often devastating. Traditional African industries, from iron working to textile production, declined under competition from imported European goods. Communities that had once been largely self-sufficient became dependent on colonial markets for both employment and essential goods. The colonial economy was designed to extract value from Angola for the benefit of Portugal and Portuguese settlers, with little consideration for African welfare or development. Yet, despite these oppressive conditions, African communities showed remarkable resilience and creativity. They adapted new crops and agricultural techniques to their own needs, developed underground networks for preserving traditional knowledge and practices, and created new forms of cultural expression that blended African and European elements. The foundation of modern Angolan culture was laid during this period of resistance and adaptation. The completion of the Benguela Railway in 1931 represented both the pinnacle of Portuguese colonial infrastructure development and a symbol of the costs of colonial rule. This railway, connecting the port of Lobito with the copper mines of the Belgian Congo, was built largely through forced African labour. Thousands of workers died during its construction, but the railway also created new opportunities for African communities and helped integrate Angola's economy with broader regional and global markets. By 1920, Portuguese control over Angola was largely complete, but this control came at an enormous price in African lives and suffering. The colonial government ruled through a combination of military force, economic coercion, and cultural suppression, but it never succeeded in completely eliminating African resistance or cultural identity. As we reach the end of this long night of colonial consolidation, we can see the foundations being laid for the liberation struggles that would dominate the 20th century. The very completeness of Portuguese control created the conditions that would eventually unite Angola's diverse peoples in their struggle for independence. The colonial education system, designed to create loyal colonial subjects, inadvertently produced a generation of African intellectuals who would become leaders of the independence movement. The forced labour systems that brought together workers from different regions helped create a sense of shared Angolan identity that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries. The suppression of African political institutions created a vacuum that would eventually be filled by nationalist organizations dedicated to liberation. In the quiet hours of your evening, as you contemplate this difficult chapter of Angola's story, remember that even under the harshest oppression, the human spirit finds ways to preserve dignity and hope. The peoples of Angola endured decades of systematic exploitation, but they never abandoned their dreams of freedom or their connections to the rich cultural traditions that had sustained them through centuries of change and challenge. Chapter 5. The Path to Independence. The middle decades of the 20th century brought winds of change sweeping across Africa, and Angola would not remain untouched by these currents of liberation and self-determination. As the 1950s dawned, a new generation of Angolan leaders began to envision a future free from Portuguese colonial rule, setting in motion events that would transform this ancient land forever. Tonight, we follow the courageous journey from colonial subjugation to hard-won independence, a path marked by sacrifice, determination, and ultimately, triumph. The seeds of Angolan nationalism were planted in the very institutions that Portuguese colonizers had established to maintain their control. Mission schools, designed to create loyal colonial subjects, instead produced intellectuals who questioned the legitimacy of foreign rule. The University of Coimbra in Portugal, where some privileged Angolans studied, became an unexpected breeding ground for anti-colonial thought, as African students encountered ideas about democracy, self-determination, and human rights. Among these student intellectuals One name stands out with particular significance: Agostinho Neto. Born in 1922 in the village of Icolo e Bengo, Neto embodied the contradictions and possibilities of colonial education. The son of a Methodist pastor, he excelled in Portuguese schools and eventually studied medicine at the University of Coimbra, but his exposure to European education only strengthened his commitment to African liberation rather than creating loyalty to Portuguese rule. Neto's poetry, written during his student years in Portugal, captured the growing consciousness of his generation. His verses spoke of love for Angola's landscape and people, of anger at colonial oppression, and of hope for a future of freedom and dignity. Lines like, "We must return to our Angola," resonated with young Angolans who had been taught to see their homeland through Portuguese eyes, but were learning to envision it as an independent African nation. The formation of the popular movement for the liberation of Angola, known by its Portuguese acronym MPLA, in 1956 marked a turning point in Angolan history. Founded in Luanda by a group of intellectuals including Neto, Viriato da Cruz, and Mario Pinto de Andrade, the MPLA represented the first organized attempt to create a unified Angolan nationalist movement. The early years of the MPLA were marked by careful organizing, political education, and attempts to build support across Angola's diverse ethnic and regional communities. The movement's leaders understood that successful resistance would require more than just opposition to Portuguese rule. It would need to create a shared vision of what an independent Angola might become. However, the MPLA was not the only organization working toward Angolan independence. Regional and ethnic differences that had been suppressed under colonial rule began to express themselves through competing nationalist movements. In the north, Holden Roberto founded the National Liberation Front of Angola, or FNLA, drawing its primary support from the Bakongo people who remembered the Great Kingdom of Congo and maintained connections with related communities across the border in the Belgian Congo. The FNLA's approach to liberation differed significantly from the MPLA's intellectual and urban focus. Roberto's movement emphasized armed struggle and drew inspiration from successful independence movements elsewhere in Africa. The FNLA established bases in the newly independent Democratic Republic of Congo and began preparing for guerrilla warfare against Portuguese forces. A third major movement, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, or UNITA, emerged later under the leadership of Jonas Savimbi. Founded in 1966, UNITA drew its primary support from the Ovimbundu people of the Central Highlands, the same communities that had resisted Portuguese conquest so tenaciously in the previous century. The existence of multiple liberation movements reflected both the strength of Angolan nationalism and the challenges facing the independence struggle. Each movement represented legitimate grievances and aspirations, but their competition for support and resources would complicate the fight against Portuguese rule and contribute to the tragic conflicts that followed independence. The Portuguese response to growing nationalist activity was swift and harsh. The colonial police, aided by informants and surveillance networks, arrested suspected nationalists, banned political meetings, and censored publications that expressed anti-colonial sentiments. Agostinho Neto himself was arrested multiple times, spending years in Portuguese prisons, where he continued to write poetry that inspired the independence movement. The decisive moment came on February 4, 1961, when MPLA militants attacked prisons and police stations in Luanda in an attempt to free political prisoners. Though the uprising was quickly suppressed, it announced to the world that Angolans were prepared to fight for their freedom. More importantly, It demonstrated that the independence struggle had moved beyond intellectual debate to active resistance. Just over a month later, on March 15, 1961, the northern regions of Angola erupted in a massive uprising that caught Portuguese authorities completely off guard. Led by the FNLA and involving thousands of rural Angolans, the northern revolt quickly spread across several provinces. Portuguese settlers, administrators, and African collaborators were killed as centuries of accumulated grievances exploded into violence. The Portuguese response was brutal and systematic. Colonial forces, reinforced by troops rushed from Portugal, launched a campaign of retribution that killed tens of thousands of Angolans and forced hundreds of thousands more to flee across the border into the Congo. Entire villages were burned, and anyone suspected of supporting the rebellion faced imprisonment or death. Yet the uprising, despite its suppression, marked the beginning of Angola's War of Independence. The three liberation movements established guerrilla bases in neighboring countries and began the long, difficult process of building the military and political capacity needed to challenge Portuguese rule. The war that began in 1961 would continue for 14 years, transforming Angola and ultimately leading to independence. The geography of Angola shaped the independence struggle in crucial ways. The MPLA established its primary bases in Zambia and later in the eastern regions of Angola, using the country's vast distances and difficult terrain to evade Portuguese forces. The FNLA operated from bases in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, launching attacks into northern Angola. UNITA, founded later in the struggle, eventually established itself in the central and southern regions. Portuguese counterinsurgency efforts were extensive and expensive. At the height of the independence war, Portugal maintained over 50,000 troops in Angola, making it one of the largest military commitments in Portuguese history. The colonial government built strategic hamlets designed to isolate rural populations from guerrilla influence, constructed roads and airfields to improve military mobility, and recruited African soldiers to fight alongside Portuguese forces. Despite these efforts, the independence movements gradually gained strength and territory. International support, particularly from newly independent African nations and socialist countries, provided weapons, training, and diplomatic backing. The Organization of African Unity officially recognized the three liberation movements and helped coordinate international support for the independence struggle. The war's impact on civilian populations was devastating. Hundreds of thousands of Angolans died in the fighting or from disease and hunger in refugee camps. Traditional rural life was disrupted as communities were forced to choose sides or flee their ancestral lands. The Portuguese introduced new tactics of rural control, including forced resettlement programs that concentrated rural populations in government-controlled areas. Yet even amid this destruction, the independence struggle contributed to the emergence of a truly national Angolan identity. Young men and women from different ethnic groups and regions served together in guerrilla units, learning Portuguese as a common language while also sharing their diverse cultural traditions. The shared experience of fighting for liberation created bonds that transcended the traditional divisions that had characterized Angolan society. The international context of the independence struggle became increasingly important as the 1960s and 70s progressed. The Cold War rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union provided both opportunities and complications for the Angolan movements. The MPLA received support from the Soviet Union and Cuba, while the FNLA and later UNITA developed relationships with the United States and other Western powers. Portugal itself was changing during these crucial years. The authoritarian regime of Antonio Salazar, which had ruled Portugal since 1928, was showing signs of strain under the pressure of expensive colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. Young Portuguese men were being conscripted to fight in Africa, and the costs of maintaining colonial rule were draining the Portuguese economy. The revolution in Portugal on April 25, 1974, changed everything. Portuguese military officers, tired of fighting unwinnable colonial wars, overthrew the Salazar regime and immediately began negotiations to end Portugal's African colonial empire. For Angola's independence movements, this sudden change created both unprecedented opportunity and new challenges. The Alvor Agreement, signed in January 1975, established a timetable for Angolan independence and created a transitional government that included representatives from all three liberation movements. November 11, 1975, was set as the date for independence, giving the competing movements less than a year to prepare for the transfer of power. However, the months between the Alvor Agreement and independence were marked by increasing conflict between the liberation movements themselves. Unable to agree on how power would be shared in an independent Angola, the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA began fighting each other even as Portuguese authority collapsed. By the time independence arrived, Angola was already sliding into civil war. On the evening of November 10, 1975, as the Portuguese flag was lowered for the last time over the governor's palace in Luanda, Agostinho Neto prepared to proclaim Angola's independence. The moment that Angolan nationalists had dreamed of for decades was finally at hand, but it came amid violence and uncertainty that overshadowed the achievement. At the stroke of midnight on November 11, 1975, Angola became an independent nation. In Luanda, Agostinho Neto spoke to a crowd gathered in Independence Square, declaring that after 5 centuries of colonial rule, Angola was finally free. But even as he spoke, the sounds of artillery fire could be heard in the distance, reminding all who listened that independence had brought not peace, but the beginning of an even more devastating conflict. In the gentle darkness of your evening, as you contemplate this moment of triumph shadowed by tragedy, remember that independence is never simply an event, but a process. The courage and sacrifice of those who fought for Angolan freedom deserve our respect and remembrance, even as we acknowledge that the struggle for true liberation was far from over. The dream of a free and united Angola had been achieved, but the work of building that nation had only just begun. Chapter 6: The Civil War and its Aftermath. The dawn of Angola's independence on November 11, 1975, should have marked the beginning of a new chapter of peace and prosperity for this ancient land. Instead, it ushered in one of Africa's longest and most devastating civil wars, a conflict that would rage for 27 years and leave deep scars across the Angolan landscape and in the hearts of its people. Tonight, we explore this tragic period with the gentle understanding that even the darkest chapters of history contain lessons about human resilience and the enduring hope for peace. As the Portuguese flag came down for the final time, Angola found itself divided between 3 competing visions of what the new nation should become. The popular movement for the liberation of Angola, led by the poet-president Agostinho Neto, controlled the capital city of Luanda and proclaimed itself the legitimate government of independent Angola. From their headquarters in the coastal city that had been the heart of Portuguese colonial administration, the MPLA attempted to extend its authority across the entire national territory. But the MPLA's claim to national leadership was immediately challenged by its former allies in the independence struggle. The National Liberation Front of Angola, under Holden Roberto's leadership, established an alternative government in the northern regions, drawing upon the support of the Bakongo people and their memories of the great kingdom of Congo. Meanwhile, Jonas Savimbi's National Union for the Total Independence of Angola controlled much of the Central Highlands, the traditional homeland of the Ovimbundu people who had resisted Portuguese conquest with such determination in earlier centuries. What had begun as a struggle for liberation from Portuguese rule thus transformed almost immediately into a contest between Angolan movements for control of the newly independent state. Each movement believed sincerely that it represented the true interests of the Angolan people, and each was prepared to fight to defend its vision of the nation's future. The international context of the Cold War transformed what might have remained a regional conflict into a proxy battleground between global superpowers. The Soviet Union and Cuba provided extensive military support to the MPLA government, including advisors, weapons, and eventually thousands of Cuban combat troops. The United States, working through allies like South Africa and Zaire, supported first the FNLA and later UNITA in their efforts to overthrow the MPLA government. The arrival of Cuban forces in Angola marked a dramatic escalation in the conflict. By early 1976, thousands of Cuban soldiers were fighting alongside MPLA forces, helping to secure the government's control over key cities and strategic regions. This international intervention was decisive in the MPLA's early survival, but it also intensified the conflict by drawing in additional foreign powers and resources. South Africa's involvement in the Angolan Civil War was particularly significant and troubling. The apartheid regime in Pretoria saw an opportunity to prevent the establishment of a hostile socialist government on its northern border, while also protecting its illegal occupation of Namibia, which bordered southern Angola. South African forces launched repeated invasions into Angola, supporting UNITA forces and attempting to overthrow the MPLA government. The human cost of these international interventions was enormous. Battles between Cuban and South African forces, equipped with modern weapons and fighting for foreign ideologies, devastated the Angolan countryside and killed thousands of civilians caught in the crossfire. The conflict that had begun as an African struggle for independence became entangled in global rivalries that prolonged the suffering of the Angolan people. Jonas Savimbi emerged as the most significant opposition leader during the long years of civil war, a charismatic speaker who had studied in Switzerland and Portugal. Savimbi combined traditional African leadership styles with modern political techniques. He built UNITA into a formidable military organization that controlled large areas of rural Angola and maintained the loyalty of many Ovimbundu communities for decades. Savimbi's ability to sustain UNITA's resistance was remarkable by any measure. Even when faced with overwhelming military pressure from MPLA and Cuban forces, UNITA managed to maintain its organizational structure, recruit new fighters, and continue its military operations. Savimbi's leadership became legendary among his followers, who saw him as a defender of Ovimbundu interests and a champion of true Angolan independence. However, the methods used by all parties in the civil war were often brutal and destructive. Military forces on all sides targeted civilian populations, destroyed infrastructure, and planted landmines that would continue to kill and maim Angolans for decades after the fighting ended. Rural communities found themselves trapped between competing armies, forced to provide support to whichever force controlled their region while living in constant fear of retaliation. The economic consequences of the civil war were devastating for ordinary Angolans. Agricultural production collapsed as farmers fled their fields or were prevented from working by military operations. Markets and transport systems were disrupted, creating shortages of food and other essential goods. The colonial economy, already designed to extract wealth rather than serve local needs, was further damaged by years of warfare. Ironically, Angola's oil wealth, discovered in offshore deposits during the 1960s, provided the MPLA government with resources to continue fighting while also attracting increased international attention. Revenue from oil exports, primarily to Western countries despite the government's socialist orientation, allowed the MPLA to purchase weapons and maintain its military forces even during the most difficult periods of the war. The discovery of diamonds in Angola's eastern regions added another dimension to the conflict. UNITA gained control over important diamond mining areas and used gem exports to finance its military operations. The international diamond trade thus became entangled in the Angolan conflict, providing resources that prolonged the fighting while enriching foreign merchants and arms dealers. Throughout the long years of civil war, ordinary Angolans showed extraordinary resilience and creativity in surviving impossible circumstances. In cities like Luanda, people developed informal economic networks that provided essential goods and services when formal institutions failed. Rural communities maintained their cultural traditions and social structures, even when displaced from their ancestral lands. Women played particularly important roles in maintaining community life during the Civil War. They organized food distribution, cared for orphaned children, and maintained educational and health services when formal institutions collapsed. Many women also participated directly in military operations, serving as fighters, intelligence gatherers, and logistical coordinators for all sides in the conflict. The international community made numerous attempts to end the Angolan Civil War through negotiated settlements. The Biscay Accords, signed in 1991 after the end of the Cold War, reduced international support for proxy conflicts, established a framework for elections and national reconciliation. The agreement called for the integration of UNITA forces into the National Army and the holding of democratic elections to determine Angola's political future. The elections held in September 1992 under international supervision were generally considered free and fair by outside observers. The MPLA, now led by José Eduardo dos Santos, following Agostinho Neto's death in 1979, won a clear majority of votes, while Jonas Savimbi's UNITA received significant support, particularly in the Central Highlands. However, Savimbi rejected the election results, claiming fraud and irregularities, and renewed the armed conflict. The resumption of fighting after the 1992 elections was particularly tragic because it dashed hopes that Angola might finally achieve peace through democratic means. The international community had invested considerable resources and prestige in the peace process, and the return to war represented a devastating setback for all those who had worked toward reconciliation. The final phase of the Civil War, lasting from 1992 until 2002, was in many ways the most intense and destructive. Both sides had learned from previous conflicts and developed more effective military strategies. The government forces, now called the Angolan Armed Forces, or FAA, gradually gained the upper hand through superior equipment and international support. The death of Jonas Savimbi on February 22, 2002, during a military operation in eastern Angola, marked the effective end of the Civil War. Savimbi's death removed the charismatic leadership that had held UNITA together through decades of conflict, and within months, his successors had negotiated a ceasefire with the government. The Luena Memorandum of Understanding, signed on April 4, 2002, formally ended 27 years of civil war in Angola. The agreement provided for the integration of UNITA forces into the National Army, the transformation of UNITA into a political party, and the beginning of national reconstruction efforts. After more than a quarter-century of conflict, Angola was finally at peace. The human cost of Angola's civil war was staggering. estimates suggest that more than 500,000 people died in the fighting, while millions more were displaced from their homes. The war created one of the world's largest populations of refugees and internally displaced persons, with entire communities scattered across the region and around the world. The physical destruction was equally severe. Infrastructure that had been built over centuries was destroyed or severely damaged. Roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, and government buildings were targeted by military forces or fell victim to neglect during the long years of conflict. Angola emerged from civil war as one of the world's most mine-contaminated countries, with explosive devices scattered across vast areas of countryside. Yet even amid this devastation, signs of hope and renewal were evident. Communities that had been separated by conflict began to reconnect with relatives and friends. Markets reopened, allowing farmers to sell their crops and families to access essential goods. Children who had known only war began to attend school and imagine different futures for themselves. The end of the Civil War also created opportunities for national reconciliation and healing. Religious leaders, traditional authorities, and civil society organizations played important roles in bringing former enemies together and helping communities process the trauma of decades of conflict. The shared experience of suffering had created new bonds of solidarity among Angolans that transcended the ethnic and regional divisions that had contributed to the conflict. In the gentle quiet of your evening, as you contemplate this long night of Angolan suffering, remember that even the most devastating conflicts eventually end, and that the human capacity for forgiveness and renewal often exceeds our ability to inflict harm. The people of Angola endured 27 years of civil war, but they never abandoned their dreams of peace and unity. Their story reminds us that no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes to those who persevere with hope and courage. Chapter 7: Modern Angola and Geographic Treasures. As the first light of the 21st century dawned over Angola, it revealed a nation forever changed by its long journey through colonialism and civil war, yet still recognizably connected to the ancient landscapes and enduring cultures that had shaped its identity for millennia. Tonight, we conclude our gentle exploration of this remarkable country by discovering how modern Angola is rebuilding itself while rediscovering the geographic treasures and natural wonders that have always been its greatest assets. The end of the Civil War in 2002 opened a new chapter in Angola's story, one written not in the language of conflict and division, but in the vocabulary of reconstruction, reconciliation, and rediscovery. President José Eduardo dos Santos, who had led the MPLA government through the darkest years of the Civil War, now faced the monumental task of transforming a war-torn nation into a functioning modern state. The challenges were immense and immediate. Millions of Angolans who had fled their homes during the Civil War began the long journey back to ancestral lands they had not seen for decades. Families separated by conflict searched for lost relatives, while communities worked to rebuild the social bonds that had sustained them through centuries of change and challenge. The government faced the daunting task of reintegrating former UNITA fighters into civilian life, while also establishing its authority in regions that had been beyond its control for decades. Yet beneath these immediate challenges lay Angola's greatest source of hope and potential, its extraordinary natural wealth. The same geographic diversity that had shaped the country's history now offered the foundation for its future prosperity. Oil reserves, both onshore and in the deep waters of the Atlantic, provided government revenues that could finance reconstruction efforts. Diamond deposits in the northeast promised additional resources for development. Iron ore, copper, and other minerals waited to be extracted from the ancient rocks of the interior. Angola's petroleum industry, which had continued operating even during the worst years of the Civil War, experienced remarkable expansion in the post-conflict period. New offshore discoveries in the deep waters of the Kwanza Basin revealed oil reserves that ranked among the largest in sub-Saharan Africa. International oil companies, attracted by Angola's geological potential and improved political stability, invested billions of dollars in exploration and production facilities. The city of Luanda, Angola's capital and largest urban center, became a symbol of both the opportunities and challenges facing the new Angola. Oil revenues financed massive construction projects that transformed the city's skyline with gleaming office towers and luxury hotels. The marginal, Luanda's waterfront boulevard, was rebuilt with wide sidewalks, landscaped gardens, and modern infrastructure that rivaled similar developments in much wealthier countries. Yet this rapid urban development also created new inequalities and social tensions. While some Angolans prospered from oil-related employment and business opportunities, millions of others struggled with poverty, unemployment, and inadequate housing. The informal settlements or musaquis that surrounded Luanda grew rapidly as rural families migrated to the capital seeking economic opportunities, creating vast communities where people lived without access to clean water, electricity, or basic services. The challenge of translating natural resource wealth into broad-based development became one of the defining issues of post-war Angola. Government leaders spoke of diversifying the economy beyond oil and diamonds, promoting agriculture, tourism, and manufacturing industries that could provide employment for Angola's young and rapidly growing population. Yet the transition from a resource-dependent economy to one based on diverse productive activities proved more difficult than many had anticipated. Agriculture, which had supported Angolan communities for thousands of years, faced particular challenges in the post-conflict period. Decades of warfare had disrupted farming systems, destroyed rural infrastructure, and scattered farming families across the region. Many of Angola's most fertile agricultural areas remained contaminated with landmines, preventing farmers from safely returning to their fields. The knowledge and skills needed for successful farming had been lost or interrupted in many communities. Despite these challenges, Angola's agricultural potential remained enormous. The country's diverse climate zones could support a wide variety of crops, from tropical fruits and coffee in the north to grains and livestock in the central highlands. The coastal waters, enriched by the Benguela Current, supported some of Africa's most productive fishing grounds. Gradually, with government support and international assistance, agricultural production began to recover in many regions. The reconstruction of Angola's infrastructure became one of the government's highest priorities in the post-war period. Chinese companies, financed through oil-backed loans, built new roads, railways, airports, and ports across the country. The rebuilding of the Benguela Railway, connecting the port of Lobito with the copper mines of the Democratic Republic of Congo, represented both a triumph of engineering and a symbol of Angola's renewed connection to regional and global markets. These infrastructure investments had profound impacts on daily life for ordinary Angolans. Communities that had been isolated during the Civil War were reconnected to markets and services. Farmers could transport their crops to urban centers, while manufactured goods and medical supplies could reach remote areas. Children could attend school regularly, and families could maintain contact with relatives in distant regions. Angola's education system, devastated by decades of conflict, required complete reconstruction. Thousands of schools had been destroyed or damaged during the Civil War, while an entire generation of young Angolans had grown up without access to formal education. The government launched ambitious programs to build new schools, train teachers, and provide educational materials in both Portuguese and local languages. The challenge of preserving and promoting Angola's cultural heritage became increasingly important as the country rebuilt itself. During the Civil War, many traditional practices and forms of knowledge had been disrupted or lost as communities fled their ancestral lands. Cultural institutions, from museums to traditional music groups, had suffered from years of neglect and conflict. Yet even amid this disruption, Angola's rich cultural traditions showed remarkable resilience. Traditional music styles like semba and kizomba gained international recognition, carrying Angolan rhythms and melodies to audiences around the world. Artists and writers began documenting and celebrating the stories and traditions that had sustained communities through the darkest years of conflict. The natural environment of Angola, despite suffering considerable damage during the Civil War, retained much of its extraordinary biodiversity and scenic beauty. The country's national parks and protected areas, neglected during decades of conflict, began to receive renewed attention from both government authorities and international conservation organizations. Kisama National Park, located just south of Luanda, became a symbol of Angola's environmental recovery. Once home to large populations of elephants, buffalo, and other wildlife, the park had been devastated by hunting and habitat destruction during the Civil War. Post-conflict conservation efforts, including the reintroduction of wildlife from other African countries, began to restore the park's ecological integrity and demonstrate Angola's commitment to environmental protection. The Iona National Park in the south, Angola's largest protected area, preserved unique desert and semi-desert ecosystems that were found nowhere else in the world. The park's landscapes, from coastal dunes to inland mountains, supported endemic plant and animal species that had evolved in isolation over millions of years. Conservation efforts here focused on protecting these unique ecosystems while also supporting the traditional lifestyles of pastoral communities who had lived in the region for generations. Angola's Atlantic coastline, stretching for over 1,600 kilometers, offered tremendous potential for both conservation and sustainable development. The cold Benguela Current supported marine ecosystems of extraordinary productivity, while coastal wetlands provided crucial habitat for migratory birds and other wildlife. Fishing communities along the coast maintained traditional practices that had sustained them for centuries, while also adapting to new technologies and market opportunities. The development of Angola's tourism industry became an important goal for economic diversification. The country's dramatic landscapes, from the Kalandula Falls in the north to the desert scenery of the south, offered attractions that could appeal to international visitors. Cultural sites, including the ruins of ancient kingdoms and colonial-era architecture, provided additional draws for tourists interested in history and culture. However, the development of tourism required significant investments in infrastructure, training, and marketing. Hotels, restaurants, and transportation systems needed to be built or improved to international standards. Local communities needed training and support to benefit from tourism development, while also preserving their cultural traditions and natural environments. The political transition that brought João Lourenço to the presidency in 2017 marked another important milestone in Angola's post-conflict development. Lourenço, a longtime MPLA leader who had participated in the independence struggle, promised to fight corruption, diversify the economy, and strengthen democratic institutions. His administration launched investigations into corruption and began implementing economic reforms designed to reduce dependence on oil revenues. These political and economic reforms faced significant challenges. Decades of conflict and authoritarian rule had created institutional weaknesses and social divisions that could not be overcome quickly. The global decline in oil prices, beginning in 2014, had reduced government revenues and highlighted the risks of economic dependence on natural resources. Yet there were also encouraging signs of progress and renewal. Civil society organizations, from human rights groups to environmental associations, gained greater freedom to operate and advocate for their causes. Independent media outlets began reporting more critically on government policies and performance. Young Angolans, educated and ambitious, started businesses and organizations that offered new approaches to old challenges. The role of women in Angolan society continued to evolve in positive directions during the post-conflict period. Women had played crucial roles during the independence struggle and civil war, both as fighters and as community leaders who maintained social institutions during the worst periods of conflict. In the post-war era, women increasingly gained access to education, employment, and political participation, though significant inequalities remained. Angola's relationship with the international community also changed dramatically after the end of the Civil War. The country joined international organizations, signed trade agreements, and developed diplomatic relationships that had been impossible during the years of conflict. Portuguese remained the official language, reflecting colonial history, but Angola also strengthened relationships with other African countries and with new partners in Asia and Latin America. The question of national identity and unity remained complex and evolving in post-conflict Angola. The shared experience of independence, struggle, and civil war had created bonds among Angolans that transcended traditional ethnic and regional divisions. Portuguese served as a common language that allowed communication across linguistic boundaries, while shared institutions like schools, hospitals, and government services created practical connections among different communities. Yet, regional and ethnic identities remained important to many Angolans, and the challenge of building a unified nation while respecting diversity continued to require careful attention and sensitive policies. Traditional authorities, from village elders to regional chiefs, played important roles in maintaining community cohesion and resolving local disputes. Their knowledge and legitimacy complemented formal government institutions in providing effective governance. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through Angola's rich and complex story, we find ourselves in a land that embodies both the challenges and the hopes of modern Africa. This is a country that has endured colonialism, civil war, and profound social transformation, yet has maintained its essential character and identity. The ancient landscapes that shaped the first human settlements continue to influence contemporary development. The cultural traditions that sustained communities through centuries of change remain vital and relevant. Angola today stands at a crossroads, with one path leading back toward the conflicts and divisions of the past, and another pointing toward a future of peace, prosperity, and unity. The choices made by Angola's leaders and people in the coming years will determine which path the country follows. Yet if history is any guide, the resilience, creativity, and determination that have characterized the Angolan people throughout their long journey will serve them well in meeting whatever challenges lie ahead. In the gentle darkness of your evening, as you contemplate the remarkable story we have shared, imagine the lights of modern Luanda reflected in the waters of the Atlantic, the quiet villages of the interior, where ancient traditions blend with new possibilities, and the vast landscapes where Angola's future is being written day by day. This is a land of extraordinary beauty and profound complexity, of ancient wisdom and youthful energy, of challenges overcome and dreams yet to be fulfilled. The story of Angola reminds us that no matter how difficult the journey, human communities possess a remarkable capacity for renewal and hope. From the great kingdoms of the past to the modern nation of today, this land and its people have shown us that even the longest night eventually gives way to dawn, and that with courage, patience, and determination, the most ambitious dreams can become reality. As you drift toward peaceful sleep, carry with you the knowledge that somewhere in the vast expanse of Africa, the people of Angola continue to write their story, drawing upon the wisdom of their ancestors and the promise of their children's futures. Their journey from ancient kingdoms through colonial oppression to independence and civil war, and finally to the hopeful rebuilding of today, stands as testimony to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The geographic treasures of Angola, its diverse landscapes, rich natural resources, and strategic location, remain, as they have always been, sources of both opportunity and challenge. But it is the people themselves, with their languages and traditions, their resilience and creativity, their capacity for both struggle and reconciliation, who are Angola's greatest treasure. May the gentle rhythms of this ancient land bring you peaceful rest, and may the story of Angola's long journey toward unity and prosperity inspire your own dreams of a better tomorrow.